I always think of this story. My husband's an elected official, a local elected official where we live, and he told me this story of another person who's also an elected official who had a meeting with some of the people in the town because it was hurricane season and we lived near the Chesapeake Bay. And he said to them, he said, "Do not rely on your local community to help you when disaster strikes. You will die in your homes. We will not come and get you, so get prepared." So I thought that he probably didn't have that whole of community response that we've been talking about today. He didn't have that hometown security flair, but it's the best preparedness quote I've ever heard, probably. So when we talk about preparedness, I think we have to look at something that Michael OBrien actually said. I thought it was a great thing to say, is that we have to look at problems as they are, not as we want them to be. And the reality is really that private citizens aren't ready. We don't have perfect budget scenarios. We don't have a perfect stream of communications. We don't have media and politicians who say what we want them to say in terms of getting people prepared. So how do we see preparedness as it is and put in place a truly national preparedness framework that brings together federal, state, local, tribal, private sector, and private citizens? Well, I have three panelists here who have all of the answers to those problems, so no pressure at all to perform today. But we first are going to start with our state and local perspective, and that our first is Ron Levell, who is with he's the project director for the Washington State Fusion Center. He's also a member of the Homeland Security Information Network Advisory Committee, and he's with the Seattle Police Department. First is not Corey Gruber, who may have been in your biographies. It's actually Miss Barb Cross, who I think has a great, she probably understands some of those quotes from the very local perspective. She's a county commissioner of Cumberland County here in Carlisle is part of that county. And we recently were at a conference together, and I really appreciated her views on preparedness in terms of how it really affects the local community. You know, we would talk about stuff very theoretically because that's what policy wonks do, and she would say, no, that's not really how it really works in a community. I appreciated that. And finally, to give really the federal overall perspective, we have Ms. Kirstjen Nielsen, who right now is the managing director and general counsel of Civitas Group in Washington, but she was the former special assistant to President Bush for prevention, preparedness, response, and she was the former member of the White House Homeland Security Council. I also will get in trouble if I don't say that she is a George Washington University senior fellow for the Homeland Security Policy Institute. So we're going to start with some remarks from each of them, then we'll go into Q&A like everyone else has done. So, Ron?
Thanks, Jena, and thanks to both the Heritage Foundation and the Army War College. It's really an honor to be here. One thing I want to correct right away is that Jena said project director for the State Fusion Center, and really I'm the project director for the regional part of that. And that's an important point I'll try and make later on as well, but the fact that there are different perspectives out there, and oftentimes we use the term state and local as though they were the same perspective, but what we really find is at the county, city, regional level, it can be very, very different than the state perspective as well. I also want to start off by addressing a couple of things that came up this morning. First, I want to, again, thank General McDaniel and others for introducing that new term to our vocabulary that I'll be able to bring back. I thought I had a good ear to the ground of what's going on in Homeland Security working in the last 10 years, but I have to admit we've been struggling with just dealing with ordinary disasters and catastrophes, and now to go back and inform my partners that we have these uber disasters or meta disasters to deal with is going to be perhaps a little disheartening for them to hear about. But on that particular topic, I think Chris Bellavita, who I guess I can say whatever I want about because I don't see Chris in the room right now. I had the pleasure of having Chris as an instructor, professor, I guess, give him greater status at the Naval Postgraduate School, and oftentimes I didn't necessarily get it right from him, but I appreciated the insights that he gave to me during that master's course. And I thought he was spot on in terms of it is really about pre-incident. And this is one of the things that we've recognized, and someone who's been involved in many disasters, personal and otherwise, I know that during the disaster, really what you're going to have to rely on is order coming out of the chaos, and that is going to be largely dependent on the stuff you've done before, pre-incident. And just to use maybe a couple examples, one of those, again, General McDaniel had brought up was this need for a common operating picture. So when the cavalry does land, they have some combined situational awareness. Well, I've done a lot of work on that with groups around the country, and one of the lessons learned about that is that you will not, during a crisis, have a common operating picture for a very long period of time, unless it's something that you've been working on together beforehand. That's why endeavors such as the Homeland Security Information Network and other things are so very important, because what they do provide is the opportunity for us to start working off a common operating picture pre-meta disaster, where we are going to it hopefully on a daily basis, but where we're sitting there and we're sharing information, and our people are becoming conversant in using the systems. We're developing those all-important relationships and trust. We're learning how to share information, so when something does happen that really strains our systems, we're able to keep using that and simply scale it up. Another example is this whole idea of the support to civilian authorities, which I think provides a great example. We need to be doing that beforehand, because we cannot wait again for the military to be worrying about a landing spot. And the different perspectives need to be incorporated. And again, I'll talk about this in a moment. But we talk about different perspectives. I was trying to imagine the 29 or so different tribes in our state and how they might react to that discussion, and whether or not they needed to be part of that. But certainly the idea of working with the Defense Department or other federal agencies pre-incident is going to be real critical. And if the idea that working with the state or discussing things beforehand would be sufficient, it's not likely to be the smooth transition. So we need to continue to seek out ways to be collaborating beforehand to talk about those things at the local level and the regional level, not just the state level. One idea, I'm sure, Mike, you'll be able to secure funding for this, and that is to actually assign liaisons beforehand that can be working with us really on a daily basis to the different needs that could be occurring in a state, to be developing those systems so we know how we're going to be communicating. We've worked out how the WMD crews will be working with our local CBRN crews and things like that. The other, one of the other common themes this morning was this idea of unity of effort. And I think it's really important, as difficult as it is to achieve, and maybe it's a hallucination at times more than it is a vision, Chris. But the elements that, through lessons learned, through mistakes and successes that we've learned that has to be part of, is you have to start off with a multi-government level, approach. And that's heavy discussion on that federal perspective, and it's really important. And the feds, whether it be FEMA, DHS, DOJ, or the military, has been just terrific partners for us. And I have to give credit to much of our success at the local and regional level to those federal endeavors. But as I mentioned, then we talk about those other government levels, and too often state and local do get lumped together as though they are the same perspective. And I can assure you they're very different. The way the state government functions and their responsibilities in terms of response and prevention are very, very different in each of our states. Another part is the tribal. We talk about typically it's the state, local, and tribal. And tribal is really a shibboleth that we have to say. But as we go around the country, we look at it, it's been enormously difficult to integrate that perspective and to really integrate their resources and to share things with them throughout the country. Fortunately, there's a number of important initiatives underway. One of them is by the Information Sharing Environment, the program manager, to do some pilots to really say, to put some meaning behind that statement. Multidisciplinary. Too often, for instance, much of our efforts have been focused on law enforcement. They need to be. but one of those honest assessments is law enforcement has all too often excluded other disciplines, such as fire and other ones for that, where they've seen it as their province, and certainly law enforcement has a key role. But it's key to really make it a truly multidisciplinary effort to bring on different disciplines, whether it be fire, emergency management, health, other ones. It has to be multi-jurisdictional, and that's enormously difficult in our country. We have approximately, just on law enforcement agencies, about 18,000 different law enforcement agencies. We've got 39 in the county that I'm in alone to work on that. And just the local political subdivisions, I don't think anyone even has an accurate count. Sometimes I read 30,000, sometimes 80,000, depend what you count in that. But that's enormously difficult to figure that out also. And I want to acknowledge that as well, because a lot of times we love at the local, regional level to complain about the feds not working, but one of the enormous challenges is, well, who do you work with? Who represents, like in my county, the 39 law enforcement agencies, who do you, besides the Seattle Police Department, whose perspective and who do you work with and who speaks for them? Fortunately, there are some great trade groups that can address some of those issues. Another important part, it has to be public-private and the private sector. And the last one is with citizens. And those last two are real interesting, because I think one of the interesting things about working with those groups and our unity of effort is they actually at times see the threat not just from our foreign adversaries and domestic adversaries, but they actually see the government oftentimes as a threat. The private sector has a lot of very legitimate concerns about what's going to be done with their information. And one of the early revelations I had that was very surprising, but now I see it frequently, is that all too often there's just a decline of assistance from government agencies because of the burden it places on them, or because of concerns about how things like information will be used. There's some great examples of that. I'm going to give one in just a moment. The last one is citizens. Now, how do we address, what's one way to address this under an umbrella? And I think that the key really is collaboration. And we talked about the 2 C's this morning, and we talked about how those are adapted to be not just command and control, but coordination and collaboration. I think really collaboration is the key, and some components of that are necessary, I think, for success. One is shared responsibility, for what happens. 2 is shared resources, actually sharing resources. 3 is sharing successes and failures. Now, sharing successes tends to be a lot easier, as the saying goes, success has 1,000 fathers, and failure is an orphan. But it's really this last one I think is the most vital and maybe the most difficult, and that's shared decision making. These are all components that make cooperation and communication and coordination very different than collaboration, and that's that shared decision making. And I think that truly is probably the most difficult one. And if we look at some of the things that we talked about today, again, is the decision-making process about who's deciding that, and that's very difficult to share that control and to put that perspective. I don't know if Tim is in here, the previous speaker from DHS, or if he had to leave, but I didn't get a chance to ask my question, but the question I was going to ask him, just to bring up this point about collaboration and perspectives, was to what extent is DHS in that effort to work on countering violent extremism in our communities, to what extent are they involving the locals? They talked about, well, we talk to them, but going out and building on things like Nadav, or that General Golan brought up about in that local community, the partnerships that are already there, and doing that collaboratively, might be a different end with a different result than DHS knocking on the door or FBI knocking on the door, to talk about that. Again, I'm not suggesting they don't have a lot to offer and very appreciative, but it's something we talk about, maybe shared decision making about how does that happen when you come out and engage in a community, Cumberland or wherever it is. Is that something that DHS decides to do, or do we decide, what partnerships, what are we going to say, how we're going to work and message with folks? This a couple quick comments here on the preparedness. I probably screwed that up. Did you have it? Usually have my daughter help me with this. Okay.
Thanks. Your youngest daughter.
Yes. She's 16, if that helps. Okay. This is the vision. You know, we talk about what's the vision for our national vision on preparedness, and I assume that if FEMA had been able to make it, they had to cancel. This is what they would have talked about. Just one key point here at the end is that the idea that you know, it is about protection and response and prevention, but it has to balance in a way that makes sense about what's the true risk. And here's the current framework. It's all available online, but I just gave you the vision. You think about there's 15 national planning scenarios, there's 8 national priorities, 37 targeted capabilities, and 1,600 universal task lists. And I'm sure there's many more that I'm not aware of, but I think this is example of a lot of hard work and great planning that has been done out there by very well-intentioned, smart, capable people. What this also presents as a huge implementation challenge and leads to other problems. That targeted capabilities list is 588 pages long. And so when you think about, when we think about preparedness, it is all about capacity and capabilities. But what does that mean to deliver and say, okay, here's 588 pages of targeted capabilities. Well, which ones that are out there? Who is supposed to have them? So why do we still have some preparedness gaps? Obvious answers, things have been discussed in this room. Some of it's the sheer size of our nation, this vast country. It's also the complexity. General Golan talked about, you know, Israel is, relatively speaking, a very tiny country, 20 miles wide at its point, narrowest point. Very, very few people compared to even some of our states. But it's just being prepared and developing capability is enormously difficult. We do need a lot of smart people. We do need programs developed so we have smart people thinking about these issues. The last thing, again, just resources. We have limited resources that are available both in time and money, and those are becoming even greater strained. But are there a couple other things that may also impact this thing? And I just wanted to, here are 3 things that I think also can impact it that we can maybe say, okay, it's vast, it's huge, boy, what can we do about it? Here are 3 things that we can maybe think about it. The lack of effective priorities, what and how we measure things, and the way we allocate grants. And what does it mean to say lack of effective nationwide priorities? And you notice that subtle shift from national to nationwide, because then I think that's a more collaborative idea that it's not federally driven only. And that first thing is, what's one of the things that impacts it? Well, if our priorities and our target capabilities and that, even if people have input, if they're ultimately decided and come down from above, you don't have that same ownership, investment in it, and they may not be as relevant and same commitment. So that's one of the things I think that makes our priorities less effective, is they tend to be federal driven. And is that the federal government's responsibility? Sure it is, but it's equally ours. One of the things that we find when we go out and work, and I work with local communities throughout the country on a number of different projects, and I think one of the biggest problems we have is that locals are all too comfortable in abdicating their responsibility to be involved in this process. It's so much easier to say, boy, it's federal government responsibility for that. Next thing, there's just too numerous. There's just too many of those things. If I say there's 1,600 tasks, universal tasks you can be working on, well, how do you figure that out, what you should be doing? Even 37 targeted capabilities. So we have these 18,000 different police departments, as just one example, picking and choosing what they work on. Well, again, that's not an effective way to deal with that. They're not specific, many of them. If you look at our 8 national priorities, one of them is expanded regional collaboration. That's a very important goal, but what does that mean translated into some kind of actionable thing? Very difficult for people to measure. I'm going to talk about some ways to deal with that. And then typically they're not funded. There's a lot of money that's given out in terms of grants, but when you look on a relative basis, it's a very tiny bit. So that's one thing. And is that funded just by the federal government? Well, we've tended just to turn to them, and the studies I think have been shown by the Heritage Foundation and other folks is that state and local funding has not increased at all toward Homeland Security, and because we've been relying solely on federal government grant funding for much of it. But there are success stories. Again, I'm an optimist, and one of them I give credit to our fire brethren out there, and that's NIMS. That is a national priority, and it has some characteristics that are really important. One is it was not driven by the federal government. It was by our firefighters who, throughout their history, had developed the incident command system model, and they suggested that it be adopted. So it was actually a bottom-up thing for that. It was something that was fully funded, that the government, again, said they'll fund the training for it. There's online programs for it. And they also were going to make it a requirement. So they translated something into a specific actionable thing, said you will not get funding unless your people complete it. And as Mike Byrne talked about, you can go really anywhere in the country, and it is one of our great success stories, is that people use this. It's part of our vernacular, and it's an example of that there are wins out there and there are models that work. Measurement and accountability. We have this, again, we really struggle with how do you measure things. And one of them is that we fall back to compliance audits. And we tend to go out and look and say, was the money spent correctly? Is that vehicle where it should be, or is it in Ron Levell's garage? We look at things, did you follow the correct procurement procedures? Did you buy only what you could do? That's a compliance audit. It has an important part of an accountability model. But what we really need to do is be doing things that in the auditing world that they call program effectiveness and results audits. And that's where you go out. It's more difficult to do, but that's where you say, can you really do this? All this equipment, does it really provide the capability? Show us, describe that type of thing. We also need to revamp our exercise and evaluation approach, because that's one of our primary methods to talk about all these terrific plans that were talked about today, incredible maritime strategies. The fact that we have bright people developing is essential, but how well are they being implemented? One of our primary ways to do it is by exercise evaluation. The problem is that exercise evaluations has got a bad name because people don't like doing them because they go to it and they don't find, what you hear from people, they don't find a lot of value. And one of the reasons they don't always find a lot of value to them is that the things that so many people are told in order to get them to participate is that, don't worry, we won't embarrass you. And really what we need sometimes is people need to be embarrassed, or organizations. I mean, sometimes they need to even go beyond that and maybe be some humiliation, with the process. But people it needs to be, when we talk about capability, it's to say, okay, look, you could not communicate this information, or you did not have the ability to respond or deal with this particular thing. That's how we find out if our implementation is going well or not. Last thing, funding problem. This we're going to like to put personal responsibility on us. Is this investment justification? That's a term DHS developed and said, okay, look, in order to get money, you're going to have to come up and fill out an investment justification. And they had peer review, et cetera. That was and the idea was to make sure you were going to actually spend money toward a good capability that was important. It was a priority with it. But because of political considerations, other things, so much of what that's been now has been, it's just a pro forma to fill that out, and jurisdictions are told in advance how much money will be allocated to them. So it's not done on something that was a very good idea to say, hey, justify that. And the other great part of that term is what is investment, because that's what we're doing as a nation, is really investing. So what's one remedy I would like to see, and this may sound heretical from the local perspective, but really a shifting from these block grants to say, okay, here's $15 million, here's $30 million of that. Start taking some of that away and say, okay, here's money for specific priorities that are true national priorities that we've all agreed on, and that you have to justify and fill out an application for those particular funds. I'd still give some money because, again, people like Chris would remind me is that you want that ability at the local level, regional level for, to have some kind of organic process where people try things out, figure out what works and what kind of capability cluster do they want to work with, who do they want to partner with, and those are a real important part of our national preparedness. Thank you.
Any other elected or appointed officials in the audience? School board members? No one. I'm the only one. And I preface that with I was appointed to the position of Commissioner in Cumberland County, not yet elected. I serve with two other commissioners in a government that is very much like most of the counties of the 67 in the Commonwealth. I can tell you for the residents of the county, and many are here today. I'm not a seagull. I think Bert, Jimmy Powers, and a few other folks that know me well. 25 years in the United States Marine Corps, retired, and my background was intelligence. So, and when it was mentioned today about hearing the expectations of the American people, I do every day. I do absolutely every day. Cumberland County's population is about 230,000. It is the same number that we heard this morning that would require medical attention. The budget of Cumberland County is about $225 million. Public safety takes 6% of that. When I ask about if there were any other elected officials, I'm going to ask, what do you think is the largest expenditure in county government? Human services. So in this county, it's 49%. And as I sit listening sort of both sides from my experience with the military and DOD, and now my role with the responsibility of 230,000 people, my concern is sort of, two things, kind of on that recovery side of when you look at the scenarios of today, the long-term impact that a community is going to face. Certainly mental health, perhaps some coping solutions, drug and alcohol, crime, delinquency, that may all then impact significantly on a community. This one happens to be a very good one. Cumberland County has been blessed with about 35,000 or more veterans. We are home to the Army War College, we are home to NAV ICP, and we have a close relationship with Letterkenny and with New Cumberland. So when you talk about a volunteer force with first responders, you have to appreciate that you're going to draw on an awful lot of men and women who sort of come to the party with a great deal of background that we can multiply with that. Again, we're sort of blessed with that. And our relationship with DOD, I think, is a little different than some of the other counties in the Commonwealth, and perhaps, around the country that don't have sort of that relationship. The interesting part, though, is nobody works for me. And I say that the first responders actually do not in the Commonwealth work for county commissioners. Public safety and the Public Safety Department, 911, the EOC, they do answer to the commissioners, as I expressed through the budget. We are part of a 9 Commonwealth task force group. We make up 8 counties in the south central part of this state form a task force. Cumberland has been a key component in this task force, a leader, and as you can appreciate, sitting here now, you're in the shadow of 3 Mile Island. So this county is a receiving county. We exercise TMI every 2 years. The next one is probably March, April timeframe. I don't know if anyone knows the specific dates in here yet, but you're all more than welcome to come back and sort of walk through that exercise with everyone in Cumberland, and also the 8 counties that are nearby. One of the key initiatives that we've taken in Cumberland is a radio project. And for many of you, you may think this is sort of a simple piece, and it is not. The county invested about $10 million so that we can talk to municipalities within just simply the county. There are 33 municipalities. Over the last 4 months, I've worked closely with the state police, who also have this same radio system, and appreciating that many other counties in the Commonwealth do not. We came on board when the state police purchased theirs, satellite off of that, and this has been a collaborative effort. Today we have a pilot that the state police and our local police have a talk group. So for the traffic on I-81 as you go home or the Pennsylvania Turnpike, I can assure you, coming into the borders of Cumberland County, if you dial 911 and you have a state trooper and he needs assistance from a local police force, they are going to be able to talk together today. We have a initiative here too for about an $18 million public safety building. Today, the 911 calls are being answered in the basement of a very old prison. So we're constructing a new building across the way. And while you can kind of talk about the bricks and mortar of the building, I can tell you that the strategic plan that went in place with the 50 people employed by public safety is going to take this particular county certainly into the next 10, 15 years. You won't find many public safety organizations that have put together and lined out their particular vision. Nor perhaps have gone as far as to say actually what their mission is. Included in that are federal, state, regional, municipal, and volunteers. In this county, we draw heavily on the NGOs for a lot of assistance. When I talked about the public safety building, there are 2 calls that come into 911. The call that someone is screaming for help, and then the second call actually goes out, and that's the call that sends hope. So you need to have that coordinated effort as to answering that call and then dispatching the best and most responsible resources. A sort of diagram there of what we're looking at. Inside that building is going to be, and I know this was mentioned earlier this morning about the web EOC and the computer-aided dispatch, and we are certainly NIMS compliant. The couple other things the county contributes. A civilian emergency response task force or team. These are CERTs. And they will respond for local flooding, catastrophic house fires that may take numerous properties. In this particular county, we've gone as far as to incorporate ag. We have 161,000 acres of farmland in this county, and I can tell you that for an ag industry, an event on a farm can be devastating, as can be the recovery of numerous cows, pigs, chickens on I-81. So if each and every one of you believe that you can sort of herd these creatures, you want to call the ag CERT teams that we have put in place to manage those kinds of incidents. The other piece that we have drawn or used significantly is education. I know this morning it was mentioned respectfully for the Vice President. Well, I can tell you he doesn't live here, because we launched a H1N1 educational piece in our 9 school districts, and each and every child was sort of led down that road for all that they could do at home, in school, at Scouts or wherever, church, to sort of keep this contained as best as we could. What do we need? Money, and certainly from my background, a sharing of intelligence, information, a fusion center that will absolutely bring this to those first responders. And when I say that, we've got another sort of component in the county, and those are the county sheriffs. Credit card collection. as an example. How many names can appear on one, and how many addresses are there? When you start seeing a pattern of individuals or names showing up on delinquent charges, and the sheriffs go forward to present the warrants, you missed them by a couple weeks. They moved. Not here. And you continue to see patterns such as this. You sort of then go into that database to say, is this happening here or somewhere else? Marriage licenses. How important is it? Well, it's issued out of the courthouse by another elected official, not me. Presenting documentation that says you're a United States citizen. Perhaps not. So that information that could have possibly prevented that marriage license from being issued might not have been shared. And of course, with the infrastructure that we have here, the Turnpike, I-81, the availability of drug trafficking, I know that was addressed, human trafficking, firearms, gang violence, the same highway system that brings you all the good goods brings you all the really bad stuff too. Excuse me. So I would invite each of you, if you can stay to 1800, the local emergency planning commission's meeting. We do this not less than once a month, and there are a variety of issues, topics that the 33 communities will send a rep, and this is how we sort of make this work in Cumberland.
Well, I would just like to thank everyone for being here. I'd like to welcome you to the last speaker and the last panel and the last event of the conference. So thank you for staying. I'd like to thank the Consortium and Jena for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure and honor. I have many of my former colleagues here. I'm sure they will keep me in line as I think back on my time in the federal government. I do want to make it clear I will talk a bit about it, but I'm not in the federal government right now, which does give me an opportunity, I hope, to be a little bit more provocative and perhaps share some questions and challenges that I believe still need to be addressed. I think what we heard last night from Secretary Stockton and then throughout the day is that the National Response Framework has really now given us a very good foundation for roles and responsibilities and how we approach different disasters and emergencies. And I think we have heard repeatedly that disasters are local. They start at the local level, and we move up through the incident command system until we get to the point where the federal government, and in some cases international entities and countries, help us respond effectively and recover from a disaster. What I want to talk about today is sort of on the fringes. So given the foundation, some of the issues that are in the fringes, perhaps in the shadows, maybe some of the elephants in the room, what are the issues that we still have yet to address? And specifically, I'd like to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities, assessment, which we talked a little bit about already, professional development, which is near and dear to my heart, and a little bit about risk if we have time at the end. I think when we talk about preparedness, we forget sometimes, although folks have mentioned it today, that it's not static. It's not a particular end state that one reaches, pats oneself on the back, and then moves on to something else. It's a continual cycle. And so when we think about it from a systemic and systematic point of view, we have to think about the parts, how to make sure they're integrated, not just from roles and responsibilities and players, but from resources and those capabilities that we hear so much about. The White House and the interagency right now are working on a new policy document that should come out in the near future. And what that will do is that will stress this idea that in addition to the National Preparedness Guidelines, the target capabilities list that we were just looking at, you really have a system. So we'll talk about a national preparedness system and then developing a variety of frameworks underneath that system, one being a prevention framework, which we heard Dr. Stockton talk a lot about last evening. I think when we talk about roles and responsibilities, there's at least three things that I'd like to ask for your thoughts as part of the community with respect to the federal role. Again, we've heard how the ICS system works. We're all very familiar with our American version of federalism. But there are three areas where I think those are stressed. One is the big issues and sort of tactics, policy questions. And I think this is a role that the federal government must play, in my opinion. But certainly, if nothing else, they need to articulate the questions. And to give you a couple examples, when we were planning as a country for a pandemic, I would suggest it was very difficult for any state or locality or particular federal department, for that matter, to perform their planning as needed until there was a policy statement with respect to the big issues like, are we going to close our borders? Are we going to close all the schools? What is the federal government going to do in a situation like that with the big policy questions so that we can all plan to them? So when we talk about ICS, how does that fit in? I think it's just a little bit of a separate conversation in the preparedness context, because here we're not yet managing an incident, so perhaps the roles are a little bit different that the federal government needs to play. We also have some questions around, are there capabilities that are uniquely federal? And we talk about the TCL, and we have state and locals doing their best to meet all 37. There is a valid point that was made earlier with respect to prioritization. Certainly every county, city, and state does not necessarily need a robust capability in every category that's listed on the TCL. And perhaps to take it one step further, there are some capabilities that are unique and need to be performed by the federal government, either because of a cost issue or perhaps because the federal government might have a unique subject matter expertise. And in that area, I'm thinking of things like perhaps nuclear detection. I'm not sure that anybody in this room would argue that any given state or especially a city or a locality needs to themselves develop a nuclear detection capability, nuclear detection response team, and have the wherewithal to do that on their own. There's also intelligence. We work very hard as a nation to share. The fusion centers are a great example of how that has evolved. But there's still something unique about the intelligence gathering process and the assessment that perhaps indicates a unique federal role that the federal government should first and foremost do and then share with their partners. Surge prevention, Dr. Stockton talked about that a little bit last night. And then perhaps some of the enablers that make everything work together, which is the planning, the bringing together, the coordination, the helping, the assistance, and we talked a little bit about grants. And here's where I'm going to get a little bit perhaps provocative and hopefully not in a pejorative way, but I do think there are some of these issues that are the elephants in the room that we sort of tend to walk around and revert back to the discussion about ICS. From a planning perspective, and given the economy that we have today, you do see a little bit of a change in what the localities do and what the federal government does. I think you can see this in a variety of measurements. One might be that last year, I guess in 2008, we had about 75 requests for federal assistance, where in 1988 we only had 11. So there's something here about states indicating and localities indicating we need more help, and that's on the financial side. The OIG report that just came out of DHS also indicates that in 1980 we had state and localities only requesting FEMA assistance 25 times, where last year we had 70 requests. So again, there's something to be said here where maybe the state and locals are indicating they need additional help. So when an event occurs, we do sometimes have situations where state and locals are overrun. That is where ICS kicks in and moves up the chain through the mutual aid, the regional, the state, and to the federal government. But if there is an event that we have pre-warning for that we know will render a state and locality unable to act, what is the federal responsibility then? And we've talked about it in various contexts. There was at one point under the National Response Plan a catastrophic incident annex and supplement that tried to get at this and tried to use language such as incident of national significance to try to indicate certain events that are so catastrophic that we know now state and locals will not be able to handle. What do we do? And I think the short answer is we try to pre-position, we try to do mission assignments ahead of time. Assistant Secretary Stockton talked about that last night as well. But more than that, is there some conversation that we need to have now that in certain instances, are there certain thresholds where we can have an agreement with state and locals now that the federal government would in fact play an additional role? And to take that one step further, what happens when state and locals say no? What happens when the federal government offers assistance, but either for a variety of reasons, and some of them being political small p, some of them being that leaders change. It could be a new leader. Perhaps they're not as well educated with the emergency management system. But what happens when they say no? And the federal government knows that, in fact, they are going to need their help. Is there a conversation now that we can have to talk about thresholds or how that might work? And two examples come to mind during Katrina. The day before landfall, there were quite a few offers of federal assistance made to the state and locality with respect to evacuation. And at the time, the state and locality felt that they could handle it, so they said no. But in retrospect, I do think there are those who sat in some of the federal seats who did know that perhaps some additional assistance was going to be required. But again, the conversation hadn't been had. So how far can the federal government push in front of a state request? Because in that case, there was no state request. Similarly, after landfall, there was an offer to integrate all of the military forces under one command to enable a more effective response. At that time, the governor did not feel that was necessary. She denied the request, and I'm not here to say whether it would have worked better or not, but the point was the conversation was not had before. And so in the middle of the event, you have a governor trying to understand her duties and her responsibilities to her state, and you have the federal government trying to understand their responsibilities to help a state that is now overrun and inundated with requests. And frankly, the state government itself, of course, at that point was a victim itself. So some of these areas are sticky. We don't like to talk about them, but there are conversations that we can have now to think about the thresholds and in what instances the federal government could push forward. And if we do, how would we do that? I think we had some questions last night, I think from some folks that are sitting right here, but sort of suggesting that there's still a feeling in the flyover part of America, I think was the term that was used, that the federal government is evil in some senses, and they're here to take over and they're here to tell the state and locals what to do. I think if we have these conversations ahead of time, we can eliminate some of that misunderstanding of the roles and what the federal government can perhaps offer. So if we think about those types of scenarios, I guess the question then is, what are the implications of that? Obviously, there's implications for planning. There's perhaps an indication for funding versus doing when we talk about grants. The federal government right now, first and foremost, is a funder. When you think about the money that goes out, $30 billion in grants since 2003. There's lots to be said, pros and cons. I think we heard some comments just now with respect to accountability and prioritization, and perhaps more guidance is needed from the federal government with respect to what to spend the money on. But the flip side is you have an interesting situation that arises when the federal government becomes the entire funder of a state and local emergency response system, which is the state and locals are then divorced from buy-in of their own system. They are told, tell us kind of things that you want. They get a check, they spend the money, they're audited on it, they're checked to make sure that they spend it, but they're now divorced from the ownership. They're divorced from working for the money and working with the citizens within their area to prepare together. Becomes a financial transaction, rather than let's all as a community plan and think about how we're going to fund this and what our priorities are. Some communities, emergency preparedness, the fight against terrorism, cybersecurity, these aren't particular priorities. So if they had their wherewithal, they might spend their money on something else. But the way the system works is we don't really have that conversation. So perhaps these threshold issues and these conversations then lead to a different balance with respect to the funding and doing and how we can do that. When we talk about state and locals, I think we have moved much more towards regional preparedness, which I think is exactly right. The terrorists certainly, and Mother Nature herself, know no state boundaries or city boundaries. I think planning geographically is the right way to go. We've seen that through, of course, the FEMA regions for quite some time. EMAC, we now will have the HERFs that will be in the 10 FEMA regions. But the roles and responsibilities there as well might change. If now it's a region preparing and a region responding, who's in charge? You might have 4 governors. I don't know how many mayors you might have, and then you have the federal government. So again, it's just an opportunity to plan and sort of train as we fight and have that conversation ahead of time. The private sector, I think, in a way, is doing more and more. We have everything from the PS Prep program that DHS is running to develop voluntary standards as required by the Post-Katrina Emergency Response Act. We also have various industries themselves working on mutual aid. One example is the WestDOG, which is the Western Airport's Disaster Operations Group. They've gotten together from a mutual aid perspective and recognized that if something happens at their airport, the people best able to help them would be another airport. And so how can they work to foster that collaboration? I think with the private sector, though, the hardest question that remains that I'd offer to you is this return on investment idea, which is very difficult if you own a business, if you're a part of the infrastructure. It's very difficult to make the case that you need to spend that extra dollar you might have on security. There's an interesting study. I hope it's interesting. I haven't read it. It will come out from the University of Texas, I think in February of this next year, in the Law and Economics Journal. But what they did is they did a lot of modeling with respect to every dollar that you spend, what is the monetary value that you get back with respect to the fight on terrorism. The particular study that they looked at is Interpol and how Interpol can help its members' countries. The figures that they came out with is for every dollar that Interpol spends on the fight against terrorism, they save $200 through their member countries with respect to not having the consequences of an attack. But studies like that, I think, are very helpful for the private sector, or, again, having the conversation with them and translating the risk of terrorism, the risk of Mother Nature, down to their bottom line. We worked recently at my firm with one of the Class 1 railroads, and they really didn't want to hear about terrorism, but they did want to hear how we could help them save money from an insurance perspective and a theft perspective. So sometimes it's just hitting on the right conversation to have to drive home the point that some of these are dual-use items. You save and you remove some of your theft, but you're also at the same time removing a threat of terrorism through our supply chain. The other thing that I laugh about with the private sector, now that I am in the private sector and I have a lot of private sector clients, is they're always asking me, what do I do? And the question back to them is, well, what's your goal? What do you want to do? Because, of course, if you tell them we'll prepare against, and then you list the panoply of things that we prepare for as a country, they're immediately not going to be interested. So the conversation really needs to be focused with the private sector as to the threats that they face and then how they can continue to help us in partnership. And citizens, individuals, I want to talk a little bit about this, although a lot of people have touched on education. I do think that there's a lot more we can do. We heard from our Israeli friends at lunch today that they actually require training in schools. We require training in schools. It sounds like the county who's hosting us today certainly takes that very seriously. The Citizen Corps report that came out last year had some pretty amazing statistics as to why people don't prepare. The top 3 reasons that continue to be the top 3 reasons from year to year are they feel that emergency responders will do it. They'll help. They'll save the day. 2, they don't know what to do. And 3, which is really part of that, is they don't have time. So there's some education that I think we all as a community need to do to make folks understand it doesn't take a lot of time. There's very easy things that you can do. And if a disaster is local, of course, it begins with you. So you need to do your part in certain ways that you could do that. Growing up in Florida, it's a little funny for me to talk about individual preparedness because it was second nature for us growing up as kids. We had hurricane drills, we had tornado drills, we had flooding drills. If you can believe it, in 2nd grade, you learn how to run from an alligator because we still had a lot of swamps where I grew up. So it was just part of what you did. You talked about it with your family, you learned it in school, you practiced it throughout the year, and it sort of became second nature. We need to just encourage our children and folks individually and as families through ready.gov or other just to take that initiative and get ready. I do want to spend a few minutes here for closing on measuring. As I talked about earlier, preparedness is not static. I think that the new preparedness system or the evolved preparedness system that FEMA and the interagency will work on pursuant to the new presidential directive will focus on new performance metrics or evolved, revised performance metrics and how we assess that. I do think the challenge, though, is very difficult. You do have the self-assessment problem, which of course is always interesting because the incentive is exactly wrong. If a state would come back to FEMA and say they're prepared, well, they won't get any money. So we have to do something about the incentives to ensure that they're aligned with not just the reporting system, but with the priorities to make sure that the specific areas are getting the capabilities that they need. Timing of data is a big problem. By the time the federal government is able to collect the data, or even a state or locality is able to collect data and assess it, it's of course only as good as when it was first gathered, which tends to be quite a while before. So I think the system needs to evolve to become flexible and think about purposes. Why are you measuring? It's one thing to measure preparedness and capabilities from the perspective of a budget cycle. It makes sense to do that yearly and to take a very comprehensive view. Perhaps the same can be said about grants, although that becomes much more difficult because it breaks down into very unlike partners who need to implement the grant funds. But there's also something to be said about the need for a snapshot look at preparedness, which is if we did have credible specific threat intel today, would we be able to assure ourselves that we are prepared for that specific threat in that area? That's a very difficult question, I think, to answer because, again, we don't collect data that way. So I wonder if there are defaults that we could discuss as a community and come up with. One might be the concept of single points of failure. If we knew, for example, that there was going to be an IED attack tomorrow in a specific state, we might talk about what are the specific points of failure that would not only enable that attack, but would prevent us from responding effectively. Another one is essential functions. Again, to use the IED attack, we'd certainly want America, as we know it, to continue. There are certain essential functions that are required to do that. Maybe we would focus on those essential functions as extracted from the capabilities list and think about if we would be able to do those. There's also a need for ops plans. We've got exercise objectives, and we've got other planning documents like the National Infrastructure Protection Plan that also requires an assessment of private sector needs, and of course resource deployment. The other part, and the last part that I think needs to be built into the new evolved revised system is the concept of foresight and thinking ahead. We tend to measure against the threat we have today, but likely by the time that we get the measurement, we understand if we're prepared, we develop a corrective action plan, we start to fill the gaps, the threat will change. So somewhere we need to build into the cycle a way to, and there actually is a foresight initiative at FEMA right now, but to take very seriously how the threat is evolving and to look at the patterns and to try to measure against that. Where will we be 7 months from now? Where will we be a year from now? Where will we be 5 years from now? And try to do that. I think I have a couple more minutes. I just would like to close on professional development. And this is more of a plea for the folks in the audience. In 2007, there was an executive order issued on professional development, 13434, a very easy number to remember. And it required a strategy, an implementation plan. It set up a programmatic office. And it required the federal government to start to take seriously this idea that there is such a thing or needs to be such a thing as a national security professional. And when we really talk about preparedness, it does, in some senses, come down to the people. And do they have the knowledge and the training that they need to be able to perform their job? And somewhere along the line, with changes in priorities and different things happening and the bureaucratics that can occur sometimes in D.C., I think most of the effort has sort of dissolved into the ether and is not very active right now. I don't know that was the best way to do it. I personally would love to hear any ideas that folks have on how to encourage that. But just as we had Goldwater Nichols, we really need something like this within Homeland Security. A lot of the problems, maybe not problems, challenges that I saw when I was in the federal government were really based on a misunderstanding of one entity of the other. You'd show up at meetings and someone would say, I'm the Department of Justice rep, I'm the Department of Defense rep, but there really wasn't an understanding as to what the Department of Justice did in any given area. A great example is there is an Office of Bombing Prevention in the Department of Homeland Security. Of course, as we know, there's also the ATF and FBI within DOJ. The three entities were logjammed for a very, very long time with respect to roles and responsibilities. And as it turned out, a lot of that was based on a misunderstanding of what each did. The FBI mistakenly understood DHS to have a 300-person strong office and it to be ready to respond and sort of operationalize an IED mission. DHS, in turn, I think at the time had 10 people in the office, and they never intended, in any case, neither did Congress, to have them be operational. They were meant to serve a coordination role and help state and locals and law enforcement understand the IED threat. So it's a small example, but it could have saved a year if we had had the ability to have all of the offices understand their roles and responsibilities and missions. And we could do that if we cross-trained, if we detailed within the federal government, if we detailed state and locals to the federal government and feds down to state and locals. I think it sort of brings me back to where I began the discussion today, which is that would enable the conversation, because then you would have something in common to be able to really talk about apples and apples rather than apples and elephants or cars or something very different that's hard to compare. So I will leave it there and turn it back to Jena, but thank you all so much. You've been very patient, and I hopefully will get you to happy hour soon.
We'll go ahead and open it up for questions. If there's not one right now, I actually want to ask a question myself. Kirstjen, you kind of discussed reasons why citizens might not be prepared in the way we want them to be. But you also mentioned kind of the rise of FEMA declarations. And I just wonder if you think to some degree that sends a mixed message, and that might be part of the reason is, as we send more and more federal dollars in, that's the message that, hey, everything will be taken care of. You don't really need to be prepared. Do you have any comments on that?
I do. I think it's a very, there's been so much work done on community resiliency. FEMA's doing a lot of work now, and there's been a lot of psychological study with respect to how citizens interact. And a lot of the research will say exactly that it is a very public way that the federal government is saying, we got this. We got it, don't worry. You do some stuff, but if it doesn't work out, we're here. And that's a very unfortunate misperception. And I'd love to hear what you all think, if that's sort of a disincentive to citizens. But I do think there is a mixed message there, because you're either responsible or you're not, right? So somewhere we have to have the joint responsibility be part of the dialogue.
Well, I think the research you brought up that shows the three reasons why are right on the mark. I think most people feel that they hire people to do that for them. There's the first responders and other people do it for them. I think people feel they're very busy. We see it in other things. It's not just the preparedness thing. Whenever you host, community forums, et cetera, about, could be, police accountability, et cetera, and most of the time it's an extraordinarily small percentage of people who don't feel they're too busy to show up.
I would say for this particular region, with such a strong agricultural background, the individual resilience is there. Certainly within communities, when you mention tribal, we certainly have Amish and Mennonite. So a little bit of, who's going to show up to fire, fight the fire.
Right.
While that initial community may start, they will certainly welcome, that township volunteer fire company. And with so many volunteer fire companies, I think that perhaps is more of an urban piece, city piece. I grew up in Pittsburgh. Police were paid, fire were paid. Here, most, if not all, many are volunteer fire. So.
Mind using the mic. Sorry.
I spoke today, so sorry. Which relinquishes personal responsibility in many urban settings. For a variety of positive reasons and other reasons we could talk about outside that, the positive realm. But people automatically are taught systemically, and children are taught systemically, Mommy and Daddy are not going to take care of me. I'll have breakfast, lunch, and now dinner at school. A very, small little example of what we're talking about. It goes on to dental health and getting the right kinds of inoculations and on and on and on. That's one thing. Another thing we see, especially in urban areas again, is fear factor. The first thing we hear from mostly elected officials is, we don't want to scare the population. Now, one of my pieces in the background, I'm a shrink. My original, where I come from, is an educator and a shrink. And one of the things I say is, a little fear goes a long way. A little fear is reality. We don't want to terrorize, and there's a huge difference between creating a fear that keeps people stuck in place and paralyzed, and that's good for no one. But the reality of, as opposed to protecting our population from the possibilities and the awful things that may fall upon us, and how we can protect ourselves and our families and then our neighbors to make it a stronger, more robust protection nationwide, we choose not to have the discussion because maybe we're going to scare someone.
I'd actually just like to add to one thing you said about preparing and helping our neighbors and our family. I think that's an interesting way to look at the personal responsibility. We have the See Something, Say Something campaign in DHS, but we also see a lot of campaigns cropping up throughout the country. LA is one where their new tagline will be, "Who will you help? Once it happens, it's too late." And the idea is, if you don't want to help yourself, fine. But who in your family do you need to help? Who in your community do you help? Who do you need to help in your office get down the stairs if you have an evacuation? So I think the conversation is also changing a little bit to think about, let's all think about ourselves as a group. Because maybe when it's just, are you prepared? Are you prepared? Whatever, I got stuff to do, I'll prepare later. But if you make it about, are you prepared for your children and your family and your communities, maybe we'll encourage more preparedness that way.
Yes, sir. And please also state your name and affiliation. Yes, sir.
I'm Rich Young from Penn State University. Kirstjen, I was listening to your comments about preparedness and actually thinking about one of the panels we had this morning where the topic of voluntarism came up. And I tend to think that these are really out of the same mold. Is it the fact that as a population we seem to be upwardly delegating to government as a provider of solutions? Is that your perspective as well?
It's interesting. I mean, I think I don't know the answer. I do think there are particular federal roles, as I suggested earlier, that we need to be clear that the federal government will take. The counter of that is there are lots of roles the federal government does not need to take. And of course there's exceptions to that. But I do think the problem with big events like Katrina or Haiti is that what everybody sees as a community and as a nation is the federal government's being very involved. And that's a lasting impression for quite some time. Now, at some point soon, you're already seeing go the other direction, which is folks are less and less concerned because we're farther and far away from a big event. But I do think Katrina changed a little bit of the way cyclically that we think. I think we can point to other times in our nation's history where we felt the same way about the federal government, but you definitely see a spike in expectations of what the federal government should provide. I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but okay.
Yes, sir. I think you have to press it down.
I do want to make one comment though to bound this discussion of over federalism because it's an issue I got a chance to address a couple of them. When post 9/11 we increased federal spending to state and local governments for preparedness from $100 million a year to $4 billion a year, and it's a huge increase. But let's not forget that the states and locals spend over $400 billion a year themselves for public safety. So this, I certainly think your point's valid, and the point's made valid about the federal involvement and that it's increasing, and the number of disasters are increasing, and that federal involvement's increasing. But at the same time, quite frankly, it's hubris on the part of the federal government to think that they're in the public safety business for a lousy $4 billion a year.
Mike, I agree, and I think what I was trying to suggest instead is I think the increase in funding is more interesting from a balance perspective. Is that really where the federal government wants to go? Do we instead want to train more? Do we want to exercise more? Do we want to have a greater role with respect to certain capabilities? But there's a balance issue there, is really what I was trying to suggest, because you do see requests increasing. So I think in response, the federal government just needs to decide how can we best help. It might be through funding. It might be through a variety of other things.
The other thing that Kirstjen brought up before, I think that one consequence of the federal funding at times is it does encourage people to be absolved of an investment. They don't feel that, hey, there's a bunch of equipment out there, okay, fine, yeah, whatever, but that true capacity, because they haven't invested in it, and whether or not they're actually being accomplished, they're not worried about it as much as if they had their own dollars in it. But the hubris part I like.
But some of the grant money that you talked about too are matching grants. So that's not necessarily all federal or state dollars coming in. Many times there will be either a local matching grant, 80-20, 60-40, that falls then either to the county level, in the case of the radio system that I mentioned, or to the township level, or to a volunteer fire company.
Dave McIntyre. Interesting day in which I've heard not one person mention what I think is the greatest reality that the United States state and local governments face in the next decade, which is budget reductions. This isn't a question about where we're going to spend more money. This is a question about how we're going to spend less money. So would you give us some thoughts about how you might see the budget pressures that we're seeing outside of this theater play out in the Homeland Security realm in the next decade?
I can give you just one example. King County, where I'm from, it's, I think, maybe the 12th largest county by population size nation. And because of budget cuts, the sheriff has announced that she's eliminating her entire Homeland Security, entire intelligence function. So they're pulling their people out of the JTTF, Fusion Center, et cetera. And I think that's played out in many places around the country. Again, maybe it goes back to that, okay, this is a federal responsibility, so it's a low priority.
But I can tell you, you're never going to find those dollars again. Okay, that's going to be, in my opinion, certainly one of those, you won't recover those funds. The South Central Task Force that I mentioned earlier, 2010 saw a 5.7 reduction from the dollars of 2009. So we're sort of seeing that, in those 8 counties. Now, the 197,000 that's sort of that shortfall, will the other counties, be able to make that up? We haven't gotten down that road that far yet, but that elimination, I would think, would be rather significant.
And it's one of those things we've looked the other way. If you look at those investment justification forms, there's a portion on it that talks about how will you sustain this, and that the intent was to say, okay, here's this initial block of money, how will you sustain it? And it's just been something that's been largely ignored in terms of the, whatever, how someone puts down, or typically an answer is with additional grants.
Yeah. But I know when you had mentioned about the nuclear piece, and of course being in, close to TMI, we've got within the South Central Task Force a incredible resource with hazmat that has stood up, trained, certified, with again that infrastructure of 83, I-81, Pennsylvania Turnpike, the close proximity we have to Washington, Philadelphia, and then the Port of Erie, too. So,
but I think that's what you'll see, because that's a scenario that they face. So I think with the budget cuts, what you'll see is risk management. You know, you'll see not just the federal government, but state and localities saying, what do we really care about? What are we really going to face? Because that's really all we have money to prepare for.
What's the threat assessment here in Cumberland County?
Right.
You know, realistically.
Steve Bucci again. Apropos the last question that was asked, do you think we'll see, in light of these kind of budget cuts where a sheriff may decide, you know, she can no longer afford those kind of specific assets for her constituency, do you think we'll see more cooperation, more regional things where, okay, we don't have a hazmat in every municipality in the county, can we get just one to cover the whole county, or even across state lines? I don't see any other way to save money and not eliminate those kind of services other than that kind of cooperation, which is not the norm anymore.
Well, I can tell you for the current situation now, Fulton County, which is a county west of us, we have been and continue probably into the next years answer their 911s. So you dial 911 in Fulton County, it is ringing today in the basement of the prison, God willing, March, brand new building, which you saw, and they compensate us with personnel. So the contract is, 24/7. No one in Fulton County, probably even knows that their 911 is being answered by Cumberland and has been for many years. So.
It may be a silver lining to this whole thing where, and a lot of people have had this conversation, is it really forced the regionalism that we really need, force people to collaborate to leverage things that are out there.
Jeremy Plant from Penn State University. I'd kind of like to follow up on Dave's point. We just went through a momentous election where clearly the American people said the greatest threat facing America was not Al-Qaeda or terrorism, it was economic decline. And somehow or another, I mean, we've had a great conversation today, but this is basically an elite discussion now. And how do you think we can bring this back into the mainstream to the political discussion that we need to, I think, to really prepare the people for the next event that may come along or for the long-term need to make this a priority? Anyone could answer.
I think it goes back to that thing of establishing true priorities, and maybe it sounds too simplistic, but I think going at that list and saying, okay, let's carve out what number are truly the most important and get those done with the funding and resources that are available, instead of having it spread, thin like peanut butter, and jelly, out there. Is that, that's one answer, is true priorities. And the other part, again, I go back to his measurement, is saying, okay, are we getting the biggest bang for our buck? People have asked for that. We're going to be forced to ask those questions. How do you know, how's this piece of equipment being used? How's this program functioning? It's like HISN right now. I'm on the advisory council. Congress put it on the critical watch list, and rightfully so, because that the projected over the next 10, 20 years of it was expenditure of $725 million. And there was real questions about, is it effective? Does it meet anyone's needs? So they're working on addressing that. But those are the kind of tough questions that sometimes don't only get asked during a crisis.
Right, but I guess my broader question was, why is it that the American people seem so unconcerned at this point about this as a priority? I mean, you're talking about addressing, making the system work, but it's a little bit below the surface, isn't it? I mean,
well, just to say, I don't know if it is irrational the way the public behaves. Just like the King County Sheriff deciding between responding to 911 calls or having somebody at a JTTF, it's probably a rational choice. And I think the American public, we'd like them to be more prepared, but sometimes the question, is it really, are they behaving irrationally, or do they get prepared when they feel a real threat? When there's a snowstorm, do they go out and buy up all the tire chains? When there's a potential hurricane, do they buy all the plywood up? Sometimes I think we have to ask, how irrational is their choice about Homeland Security preparedness?
This is probably the last question.
Hi, not a question, but I'm Lieutenant Colonel Rich Johnson. I'm with the Massachusetts Army National Guard, but I'm also a trooper in my civilian career. So I've been a police officer about 20 years, and I hear and understand a lot about what you're saying, but more of a comment, I guess. I don't think it's irrational at all. I think that somebody said in the first panel this morning, it takes a catastrophe to change anything. I mean, if you forget that, that's kind of the premise for all of these discussions. You have to, it's very rational, and the things that drive Americans most is their economic interests. I mean, how you stand with your family and whether or not you can pay your bills are always the first thing you worry about. It drives crime. It drives, just about everything. Every decision we make in government. Your sheriff in King County decides, just like all police departments, ironically, by the way, they'll withdraw their people from task force when it's probably the best answer is to share. We retract and we close down and we get parochial and we think about our own interests. It's what we are, unfortunately. Rugged individualism built the country, but it's also, in a way, it's our road to our downfall. So, just a comment.
Any comments?
Well, no, but I think the interoperability that, we talked about, I mean, as I said, the $10 million for this radio system in this county, that catastrophe is you're clicking it, nobody's hearing you. You're shouting, you're screaming. 2 cars are here, you can't even talk. 5 guys go into a building for fire, and they're not able to talk. That's a responsibility that the residents of most communities, whether it's, post 9/11, why can't we talk? Why can't we simply talk? How much money can you throw at this to sort of make this work? Is it another $80,000 tower? Is it training? Is it, new equipment? But those are components, sort of in a bigger scheme of being prepared, of having exercised those radios, that system, for here again. We see the feds, every 2 years, if not more, with 3 Mile Island. That is not an uncomfortable, awkward exercise to go through here. So, but other communities may not have that luxury. They may not.
Ma'am, I would just add, if you don't mind, the other thing that comes to mind is if you know the short history of all these grants among police departments, and where I come from, we're a little bit different. The Northeast is a different kind of animal when you're talking about police unions and police politics and public safety politics. It's a little different. But essentially, it's the same argument. They created a system of competition between departments instead of a system where it was comprehensive and looked at the needs of a region or an area or multiple departments. We started to compete for grants, and we started to fight each other, and the old parochial thing took over. And that's my experience, and I have a pretty good understanding of how it worked in my area of the country. I hope that people are more cooperative and collaborative in other parts of the country, but in my part of the country, police departments fought tooth and nail for grant money and didn't care what the next police department was doing. And the federal government did nothing to referee that fight and make it fair for the people who were ultimately the victim or the victor.
All right, we're going to go ahead and close with that closing remark. I want to thank all 3 of you for fabulous remarks today and a great discussion. We have a little gift from the Army War College in nice paperweights, so I'll give each of you these. And please join me in thanking these.
Thank you.
It was nice meeting
It was lovely to meet you, yeah.
Hi, Ron. Thanks.
If I could, please, unfortunately, Kirstjen gave a great presentation. She also tried to cut our knees right out from under us. We are not done. I would like, please, for the moderators, Kirstjen, you may leave. The moderators, if you would, please come back to the panel here for just a wrap-up, because what we wanted to do at the end of this is to get a wrap-up from the moderators, their thoughts on it, and more importantly, your thoughts on the forum and where we ought to go. So if you will just stay with us for a little while longer. Is Frank Salufo here? If he's not, I shall. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Okay. Rick, please come on down.
We're supposed to give our final observations then. Bert, is that what?
About 5 minutes of wrap, please.
5 minutes. In my experience, it's been mostly on the counterterrorism front, more so than the Homeland Security front. But I have been able to watch the dialogue and certainly been involved in it through the last 10 years. My observation over the last year, being at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and kind of was punctuated by this conference today and some of the other meetings I've been through on information sharing recently, is that I personally have seen a shift in the dialogue, which I think is encouraging. And I hope it continues. We're getting down to the more difficult problems, but it's an encouraging shift. It's a shift from, the federal government driving some of these solutions, or thinking they had the answers to these solutions, or they're the first ones to have ideas of these solutions, and forcing it down to now where I'm seeing a lot more things coming up from the communities, local communities and state and local governments, better organization, a better understanding of how to work with the federal government. So it's no longer, not that it's not significantly driven by the federal government, but that paradigm is shifting. And I think that's very, very encouraging, because I don't think that we want to. The state and local communities have to do risk management. It's one of the things that we're struggling with the fusion centers, and I didn't get to ask that question, but the value proposition for the federal government on the fusion centers is counterterrorism information. That's not the value proposition for the state and local governments for the fusion centers, in my opinion. Terrorism for the state and locals is, unless you're from New York or LA or Washington D.C., isn't that high on your list. It's policing, community policing. So how do you bridge that value proposition gap to make sure that you can continue that coordination and share that information, so the state and local governments get out of it what they need, and at the same time the federal government can get out of it what it needs. And I think that's critically important. And again, some of the conversation we've had today are these very challenging problems, but we're past the unity of command. I mean, I think we touched on that in our panel early on. As a federal government, it's almost as we as Americans look at culture versus some other places like Afghanistan, where we look at we're Americans first, and then we might be from a state, we might be from a town. Where elsewhere it's we're from a tribe, and then we're from a village, and then maybe we're from a country. But it's that inverse on the switch. We were talking about the information this morning with the maritime security. Is we first started this, we were talking about who's in charge. That's still a really important question, especially related to the federal government. But it's no longer the driving factor. We're now no longer running around asking for who's in charge. We're now really more concerned about the unity of effort. And when you have, Assistant Secretary Stockton talking about that, and I see it permeating the Washington, D.C. dialogue, and when I do go out in the state and local communities, I see it there as well. It's like, okay, who's in charge is important, but what's really in charge is getting all of the equipment, getting all of the resources to the right place at the right time, and it's organizing this. And that's encouraging. And it's also, too, we did a big shift when we first started this stuff with Homeland Security. We don't remember we had the disaster scenarios. What were the scenarios we needed to respond to? And I think that we've learned over the years that you can't do scenario-based planning necessarily to predict everything that's going to happen, because you don't know what the next disaster is going to be like. And so if you put somebody in charge and say this is how they're going to run this natural disaster, and you can develop plans to respond to that particular disaster, you can run into problems. Whereas if you say, okay, we don't know what the next crisis is going to be, the Uber crisis, but if we learn how to talk to each other, if we learn how to share information, if we learn what our roles and responsibilities are, then we can, self-organize to a large degree, and we can make sure that the appropriate unity of effort is put forward to address these issues. Now, that's just some thematic observations that I've taken from today, and I'll turn it over to you, Jenna.
Yeah, I'll be less than 5 minutes.
Was I more than 5 minutes?
No. Significantly less than 5 minutes. There's 2 or 3 things that I thought were great that came out today that I was glad we talked about, and one thing that we didn't talk about that I think is really important. The first is I'm glad we hit on budgets. I mean, anybody who is in HLS knows that if that's going to be one of our biggest challenges coming up, not only just on the funding from a state, local, federal, regional perspective, but also small and medium-sized businesses, their choices, and also big businesses, what choices they make in terms of planning and preparedness. All of that is affected by the bottom line, and that decreases in the current both budget situation and the economy. You also have citizen preparedness. Most people aren't going to necessarily make the right decisions when they have less money to work with. If they may need food on the table as opposed to extra food for some sort of disaster. I think, and I hope, and I thought it was mentioned that maybe this will help drive more risk-based decisions, and I hope that that's what might come out of it, but it's difficult to tell. I think the second thing is training and professional development. I was glad that was mentioned. That's something that is a key piece that we often don't take seriously enough, and I think that that has to go forward. But the thing that wasn't mentioned, I think, is, and it's tangential, but it affects every part of this, is the issue of congressional oversight. You know, you have how many different committees, subcommittees, commissions with jurisdiction over Homeland Security matters, and I think that impedes policy implementation at so many different levels that if we don't find a way to get leadership engaged on solving the problem, that a lot of these issues might take a next step forward. And I think congressional oversight has to be part of whatever we do in the next couple of years on Homeland Security.
I got tons of time, but I'm not going to use it all. I mentioned to someone in passing, and I don't mean to blow sunshine at anybody, but I mentioned to someone in passing that I really felt that we were privileged here because we had two of the best minds in Homeland Security in these affairs, starting with Dr. Paul Stockton's comments last night, and then going on a little bit more with Chris Bellavita earlier this morning. And I want to draw a little bit from both of what both of them said, and the finest Bellavita tradition, disagree with some of what was said. I want to start with Chris's comments this morning, and I think sometimes Chris says things that are deliberately inflammatory to see how we react. But when Chris says that catastrophes do not lend themselves particularly well to mechanisms of unity of effort, then I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, we need to change those mechanisms, or we need to fix those mechanisms now before they have to be here. The mechanisms would be, therefore, wrong. And the reason I'm saying that is going back to what Ron said in this last panel. It's mostly about pre-incident. It's mostly about what we do to prepare our people ahead of time. And what the local governments, state and local governments can do towards that preparation is fine, and it's the most essential thing. And what they cannot do, the federal government is in charge of. That is their responsibility. When Paul last night was talking about, okay, all disasters are local, is all prevention local? The answer is yes and no. Where it is true is the most of what is going to be done in terms of response and recovery. In terms of prevention, that's also probably true, but when it exceeds their capability in terms of intelligence and in terms of planning, then I think that the federal government has a certain requirement there. And I was suggesting that planning that we need to adopt a new mindset here, a mindset of templates, not mandates. Take the expertise that we have in the federal government, take the expertise that we have residing in the military, direct them towards those plans, and offer them as a tool to our people, not something to be jammed down their throats. Should DOD be taking lead on the issue? No, but DOD, particularly within light of, let me back up on that a little bit, with apologies to my friends from the National Guard. Should the military be taking lead on those issues? No, not necessarily, but the military should be at least a willing, if not an aggressive, partner in the planning towards those issues. And I backed up on that statement because the closest military involved in these issues should be the people who are going to respond first, the people who know the people they're going to be working with first, and that, ladies and gentlemen, remains our National Guard. Should there be partnership beyond that? Absolutely, and we're seeing that partnership displayed exceedingly well now under the capable leadership of the United States Northern Command and the steps that the Admiral has already taken out very aggressively, and we appreciate that taking place. With regard to one of the other things that was brought up several times, as it should be over and over again, and Kirstjen was the last to say it, both of the first two Secretaries of Homeland Security worked mightily towards trying to build a mechanism toward regionalism, beyond the FEMA regions, the next step, if you will, and both of them were somewhat frustrated in their attempts. A regional mechanism is going to be important, not for the day-to-day activities, not even for day-to-day, getting back to another oxymoron, not even for our normal disasters, but the catastrophic events that we're talking about in some of our discussions here. And that at that point, when, as Kirstjen pointed out, when nature defies regional boundaries, then state boundaries, then something else is going to have to be done. And that's where the regional structure is going to have to take place. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategy, Prevention, and Mission Assurance said this morning, The military probably should not be in the lead on that regional structure. And it's not there right now, and it's because we're still in, as Mike said, a walk mode before we get into the run. But when the structure is put together, probably, once again, ladies and gentlemen, the civil component should have the lead on that. And the military's part of that structure should be collaborative, if not in following. So those are some of the things that came out of it in my particular perspective. As you might expect, a little more inclined towards the military role and where the military does and does not fit. But what we wanted to do in the remaining time that we have here, remaining 15 minutes, is to draw from you all. There's something that has been weighing heavily upon you the entire time, and I'm going to give you a good 2 minutes to get it across if you would like to here as we wrap up our session. Steve. Use Lydia's.